Every nation has a line it swears it will never cross. For India, that line was gold. In the summer of 1991, as most of the country slept, trucks rolled through Mumbai under the cover of darkness. Their cargo was not announced in newspapers, not debated in parliament, not tweeted or photographed. It was only known to a tiny circle of officials, soldiers, and bankers who understood that what lay in those trucks could decide whether the Indian state kept its promises or watched them collapse. Inside the trucks were sealed wooden boxes. Inside the boxes was gold. From the Reserve Bank of India's vaults, that gold was quietly moved to the airport, watched by armed guards who had been given only partial explanations. On the tarmac, in humid night air, those boxes were loaded onto a waiting aircraft. No fanfare, no ceremony. Just the dull thud of heavy metal on metal, the clank of chains, and the constant awareness that if this operation failed, it wouldn't just be a logistical failure, it would be a national one. Within hours, that gold would be flying out of the country and into the vaults of foreign banks in London and Zurich. Not as a sale, as collateral, as a last-ditch pledge to convince the world that India's promises still meant something. The country that had fought for political independence from the British Empire was now sending its treasure back into British vaults to avoid a different kind of surrender. This is the gold dossier, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. And this is the story of India, 1991 gold airlift. How a nation on the brink of default rescued itself by putting its most sacred asset on the line, and why that night in 1991 still shapes the world you live in today. Crises almost never arrive out of nowhere. They creep in quietly, disguised as numbers on a page, minor news items, and technical warnings that most people ignore. India's crisis in 1991 didn't begin with planes full of gold. It began years earlier with choices that made sense in the moment and became dangerous in combination. All through the 1980s, India was trying to do something difficult, grow faster without surrendering control. The state ran a tightly regulated economy, the license Raj, where permits, approvals, and controls governed who could produce what and how much. At the same time, there was a growing hunger for higher growth, modern technology, and a better standard of living. To bridge that gap, the government started to borrow more from abroad. External debt rose. Imports of high-value goods increased. The rupee was kept stronger than it should have been. On paper, it worked for a while. Growth picked up. Consumption increased. Politicians could point to rising activity and say the model was working. Under the surface, two dangerous imbalances were building. The first was a fiscal deficit. The government was spending much more than it was earning in taxes and revenue. The second was a current account deficit. The nation was importing more than it was exporting, and the gap had to be filled with foreign borrowing. Economists call this a twin deficit problem. In calm times, it is survivable. In turbulent times, it becomes explosive. Turbulence arrived at the worst possible moment. By 1990, the Soviet Union, one of India's largest trading partners and a key buyer of Indian goods, was collapsing. Trade agreements that had been stable for decades suddenly looked fragile. At the same time, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in the Gulf War sent global oil prices sharply higher. India, heavily dependent on imported oil, watched its import bills surge. Every extra dollar spent on oil widened the external deficit further. Meanwhile, foreign lenders and rating agencies were growing uneasy. They looked at India's rising debt, slow reforms, and political instability, and began to ask a dangerous question. Would this country be able to pay us back? When that question arises, the flow of money changes direction. What used to be easy refinancing turns into hesitation. New loans get smaller, old loans are pulled, foreign capital begins to move away. By early 1991, India's foreign exchange reserves had fallen to levels most people would have considered unthinkable. They were barely enough to cover a few weeks of essential imports, 2 to 3 weeks of oil, 2 to 3 weeks of medicine, 2 to 3 weeks of spare parts for power plants, industrial machinery, and transport. That is not a cushion, that is the edge of a cliff. On top of this, political uncertainty made everything worse. In early 1991, the government failed to pass a budget and lost its majority. International rating agencies downgraded India's sovereign debt. Multilateral institutions grew cautious. What had been a long, slow drift toward instability turned into a full-blown balance of payments crisis. When a sovereign nation reaches this point, the polite language disappears. You are no longer negotiating, you're trying not to drown. So what do you do when your promises are no longer enough? When lenders no longer trust your bonds, your speeches, or your assurances? You put something real on the table. For centuries, gold has been that something. It is not a policy, not a statement, not a forecast. It is metal, it is weight. It is collateral that does not care about elections, speeches, or ideology. India had gold. The state and the central bank held significant reserves. There was gold bought over time, gold held by the Reserve Bank, gold that had come into government hands from confiscated smuggling operations. For years, it had sat in vaults as a symbol of stability and sovereignty. In 1991, it became a bargaining chip. The plan that emerged inside the Ministry of Finance and the Reserve Bank was both simple and drastic. Pledge a portion of India's gold to secure emergency foreign currency loans. Not a sale, a pledge. The gold would be shipped abroad and locked in the vaults of foreign banks, and in exchange, India would receive desperately needed hard currency to pay its bills and reassure the world that it would not default. On paper, it was a technical operation. In the real world, it touched nerves that went far beyond economics. Gold in India is not just a reserve asset. It is embedded in culture, religion, and memory. Families measure their security in gold. Weddings are adorned in it. Myths and stories wrap themselves around it. For a state that had long prided itself on economic self-reliance, the idea of sending national gold abroad felt like selling the family jewelry to keep the house from being repossessed. But the arithmetic left little choice. In May 1991, the first step was taken quietly. Around 20 tons of gold were shipped to a Swiss bank. Soon after, a larger operation was planned. 47 tons would be pledged to the Bank of England. In total, 67 tons of India OS gold would be sent abroad as collateral for roughly $600 million in emergency financing and to unlock a larger IMF-backed rescue package. The mechanics of the operation read like a heist story in reverse. Gold was pulled from the Reserve Bank's vaults, where it had rested for years. It was counted, weighed, packed, sealed. Armored vehicles were arranged. Security forces were briefed with partial information. The mission needed to be protected, but it also needed to remain invisible to the public. A convoy carrying that much gold in broad daylight would have caused panic, outrage, and political uproar. So it moved mostly at night. There are stories of one of the trucks suffering a tire burst on the way to the airport. The vehicle lurched to a halt on a dark road. Armed guards climbed out, formed a tight circle around the truck, and waited while a spare tire was brought. Few people passing by knew they were driving past a moving piece of national history. At the airport, the boxes were loaded onto a chartered aircraft. Flight plans were filed, but the details were deliberately vague. Only a handful of people in the system knew exactly what was happening, where the plane was going, and what was strapped down in its hold. In London and Zurich, vault doors would open to receive metal that represented not just value, but vulnerability. From the lender's perspective, the message was simple and powerful. This was not just another plea for help. This was a country putting its most sacred asset on the table. If India defaulted, the foreign banks held gold they could seize and sell. If India survived, the gold would eventually come back. Gold turned India's weak promises into credible collateral. As the gold arrived in foreign vaults, lines of credit opened. Emergency loans were dispersed. Payments for oil and other critical imports could be made. Default, which had been weeks away, was pushed back. The airlift bought time, and that time was used to rewrite the rules of the Indian economy. In June 1991, a new government took office. P.V. Narasimha Rao became Prime Minister. Manmohan Singh, a technocrat with deep economic experience, became Finance Minister. The gold was already pledged. The reserves were still dangerously low. The IMF and other institutions had made their conditions clear. The result was one of the most significant economic turning points in India's modern history. In July 1991, the rupee was sharply devalued in two quick moves. Imports became more expensive. Exports became more competitive. The protected, inward-looking model that had dominated for decades began to unwind. Industrial licensing rules were relaxed or abolished in many sectors. Foreign investment restrictions were eased. Tariffs were gradually brought down. Budget policy shifted, at least in principle, toward reducing the fiscal deficit. In Indian political memory, 1991 became the birth year of liberalization, the start of a long, uneven journey toward a more open, market-driven economy. What is easy to forget is that this transformation was not born in comfort or confidence. It was born under duress, under the shadow of potential default, with gold sitting in foreign vaults as collateral for the world's patience. On paper, the story sounds clean and victorious. There was a crisis, the gold was pledged, reforms were introduced, growth accelerated, and the gold eventually came home. Reality was rougher. For ordinary Indians, the crisis and its cure meant higher fuel prices, budget cuts, import controls in the short term, and inflation that gnawed at salaries and savings. The abstract phrase, balance of payments crisis, translated into concrete pain. For politicians and many citizens, the gold airlift itself was a source of deep embarrassment. The image of Indian gold sitting in the Bank of England decades after independence cut like a fresh wound. Critics argued that careless borrowing, political indecision, and a refusal to reform earlier had pushed the country into a corner. Supporters argued that once the corner had been reached, there were no painless options left. Both views contained truth. That is how financial history usually works. By the time you get to the spectacular scene, the planes, the vaults, the emergency loans, the real mistakes have already been made. They were made years earlier, when deficits were described as temporary, when warnings were dismissed, when small sacrifices that could have prevented a disaster were judged politically inconvenient. The gold airlift was not the cause of India's crisis. It was the price of ignoring it until the last moment. Seen from a distance, the pattern India followed in 1991 is familiar. When countries face severe external crises, three things tend to happen. Trust evaporates. Paper promises lose their weight. Hard collateral becomes king. Investors who used to see your bonds as safe suddenly see them as risky. They stop rolling over short-term debt. They pull money out. The rating on your sovereign goes down, and the interest rate you must pay goes up. It becomes harder and more expensive to borrow exactly when you need money the most. That is the first phase. The second phase is when speeches and policies stop working. You can announce austerity plans, talk about reform, even start them, but if the market believes you are too late, your words won't move the needle. Your credibility is the currency, and it has already been spent. The third phase is when you either default or bring something tangible to the table. Gold, foreign currency reserves, strategic assets, or formal agreements with powerful lenders. India chose the third path. It pledged gold, accepted IMF conditionality, and bought time to restructure its economy. What happened afterwards is just as revealing. Over the next decades, as reforms took root and growth increased, India rebuilt its foreign exchange reserves. It diversified its sources of external earnings. It developed a deeper domestic financial system. Once the immediate crisis faded, the gold that had been pledged was returned. Later, India actually increased its gold holdings, including a large purchase from the International Monetary Fund in 2009. In recent years, the Reserve Bank has even moved more of its gold back into domestic vaults, shifting the symbolic balance from foreign custody toward home. In other words, the same asset that had once been flown out in desperation became, again, a marker of renewed confidence. There is another lesson hidden in this story. Sovereignty is not just about flags and borders. It can be measured in cold financial terms by how long a country can survive without the kindness of strangers. In 1991, India's sovereignty could be expressed as a small number of weeks of imports. When that number approached zero, the choices narrowed quickly. You can be politically independent and financially cornered at the same time. And when that happens, you do not get to dictate the script. You choose between different forms of pain, different forms of humiliation, and different futures. In 1991, India chose to avoid an open default. It chose to pledge its gold rather than refuse payment. It chose to accept a shock program of reforms rather than drift into isolation and chaos. It chose to endure a controlled burn instead of an uncontrolled collapse. You can debate who benefited most from the reforms that followed. You can argue about the rise of inequality, about crony capitalism, about how much of the population has truly gained from 3 decades of liberalization. Those are important debates. But they all take place in a world shaped by the decisions made in that desperate summer, when gold boxes rolled silently through Mumbai's streets and disappeared into the belly of a plane. The story of India's 1991 gold airlift is not just about bullion and balance sheets. It is about a nation forced to confront the limits of its old model and to decide what it was willing to sacrifice to buy itself another chance. Those 67 tons of gold, sitting behind thick doors and foreign vaults, represented more than collateral. They were a physical embodiment of a promise. We will change. We will pay. We will not go down without a fight. 3 decades later, when you look at India's role in the global economy, its technology industry, its rising middle class, its still unresolved inequalities, you are seeing the long shadow of that promise. That is what moments like 1991 really are. Points where pride, necessity, and cold arithmetic collide. Points where history stops being an abstract story and becomes a negotiation conducted in the language of ships, planes, loans, and metal. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.